The pencil trembled in Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer's hand as he stared at another sheet of 5-digit numbers. His eyes burned from the fluorescent lights in the windowless basement, and the benzodrine tablets coursing through his system kept him conscious, but did nothing for the crushing weight pressing down on his shoulders. Every number group on that page represented a potential answer to the most important question in the Pacific Theater. Every calculation could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. Around him, IBM punch card machines clattered and hummed, generating heat that made the cramped underground space nearly unbearable. Stacks of cards towered on every available surface, each one representing hours of meticulous analysis by a team pushed far beyond what anyone thought humanly possible. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, coffee, and sweat. Nobody had opened a window because there were no windows. This was Station Hypo, the basement dungeon beneath the old administration building at Pearl Harbor, where a handful of exhausted men were trying to read the mind of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The date was May 27, 1942. In a command center 3 floors above this sweltering basement, Admiral Chester Nimitz waited for information that would determine whether he gambled his remaining 3 aircraft carriers against a Japanese force that outnumbered him in every category. After 6 months of disasters across the Pacific, this might represent America's last opportunity to stop Japanese expansion before it became unstoppable. One incorrect interpretation of these code groups, one mistaken assumption about enemy intentions, and the Pacific War could be decided before summer ended. Dyer reached for another punch card, comparing encrypted number sequences against patterns his team had assembled through 6 months of brutal analytical work. Beside him, Commander Joseph Rochefort stood in his characteristic bathrobe and slippers, having spent days in this underground facility without leaving. The bathrobe wasn't an affectation or eccentric behavior, though many would later describe it that way. The basement ventilation was inadequate, and the heat from the IBM equipment made proper naval uniforms practically unbearable during marathon work sessions. Rochefort's approach was purely practical. Getting results mattered infinitely more than military dress codes in this cramped workspace where the fate of nations was being decided by men hunched over worksheets and punch cards. Neither man fully understood that within the next week their analytical work would fundamentally alter the course of the Pacific War and possibly World War itself. The intercepted messages were unambiguous about certain facts. The Imperial Japanese Navy was planning the largest naval operation since the Pearl Harbor attack. 4 fleet carriers, dozens of supporting warships, and hundreds of the world's most experienced naval aviators were converging on a target designated by 2 letters in Japanese naval code. Those letters were AF. The question haunting every analyst in that basement was devastatingly simple, yet potentially catastrophic. What did AF represent? Where would the Japanese strike next? Get the answer wrong, and America would lose the Pacific War before the summer solstice. The mathematics were brutally straightforward. Japan possessed 10 fleet carriers at the beginning of hostilities. America had 3 remaining in the Pacific, and one of those, Yorktown, was severely damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. If Admiral Nimitz positioned his carriers incorrectly, if Station Hypo's analysis proved faulty, the Japanese combined fleet would accomplish what the Pearl Harbor attack had failed to achieve: complete annihilation of American naval power in the Pacific Ocean. The transformation had begun 6 months earlier, on a morning that permanently changed both nations. December 7, 1941, arrived bright and peaceful across the Hawaiian Islands. Families prepared for Sunday church services. Sailors aboard battleships moored at Ford Island ate breakfast or caught extra sleep on what should have been a quiet morning. The Pacific Fleet rested at anchor, powerful yet complacent, completely unaware that catastrophe was mere minutes away. At precisely 7:55 that morning, peace died screaming. 353 Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor in 2 devastating waves. The attack had been planned with obsessive precision by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist who understood both Japan's temporary advantages and America's terrifying long-term industrial superiority. His objective was elegantly simple: destroy the Pacific Fleet before America could mobilize its vast manufacturing resources. Give Japan 6 months to consolidate conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, then negotiate peace from a position of overwhelming strength. Within 2 hours, the results were catastrophic beyond imagination. 8 battleships lay sunk or damaged in the harbor. USS Arizona exploded with such apocalyptic force that over 1,100 men died in seconds, entombed forever inside their ship. An 1,800-pound armor-piercing bomb converted from a battleship shell had penetrated the forward magazine, triggering an explosion so massive it lifted the 30,000-ton warship completely out of the water. Men witnessing it from other vessels would never erase the sight of Arizona rising, breaking apart, and settling to the harbor bottom in less than 9 minutes. USS Oklahoma rolled completely over after torpedo hits opened massive holes along her port side, trapping 429 sailors and Marines inside her capsized hull. Some survived in air pockets for days, their desperate hammering on the hull clearly audible to rescue workers who couldn't reach them before their air ran out. USS West Virginia settled onto the harbor bottom with 106 crew members lost. Unlike Oklahoma and Arizona, West Virginia would eventually be raised, repaired, and returned to active service, fighting in major Pacific battles. But on December 7th, she represented just another symbol of American vulnerability. Over 180 aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could launch. Hangars and maintenance facilities demolished, 2,403 Americans dead. The breakdown revealed the comprehensive nature of the devastation. Navy 1,298, Marine Corps 109, Army 218, civilians 68, another 1,000 wounded. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield against Japanese expansion, lay shattered in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet commander, watched his command burn from headquarters windows. As he stood there attempting to comprehend the disaster's magnitude, a spent bullet shattered glass beside him. He reached down to pick up the deformed projectile, examined it for a long moment, then said quietly to a nearby aide that it would have been merciful if it had killed him. Kimmel understood his career was finished, that he would bear responsibility for America's greatest military disaster. Within days, he would be relieved of command, replaced by Chester Nimitz. His request for a court-martial to clear his name would be denied. The blame for Pearl Harbor would follow him to his grave decades later. But the attack, devastating as it proved, had missed the most valuable targets. All 3 Pacific Fleet carriers were absent that morning through a combination of operational scheduling and extraordinary luck. Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island, delayed by weather that would prove providential. Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway Atoll. Saratoga sat in dry dock on the west coast, undergoing scheduled maintenance. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, would win this war, though few yet understood that fundamental shift in naval power. The era of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon was ending that morning. The era of carrier warfare was beginning, and America, through luck and Japanese miscalculation, still possessed its most powerful weapons. The Japanese had also ignored Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, massive installations holding millions of gallons of oil that kept the fleet operational. They bypassed repair facilities, dry docks, submarine bases, and naval yard infrastructure. Japanese planners assumed these would be irrelevant after the fleet was destroyed. They were catastrophically wrong. These intact facilities would enable Pearl Harbor to serve as the primary staging base for America's Pacific counteroffensive. The submarines based there would devastate Japanese merchant shipping throughout the war. The repair yards would resurrect damaged ships, including some the Japanese believed they had permanently sunk. Within months, Pearl Harbor would transform from a symbol of defeat into a hive of activity supporting the war effort. In that basement dungeon, Commander Joseph Rochefort inherited an impossible task. Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit in Hawaii, had been tracking Japanese communications for years with limited success. The unit's official designation was Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, but everyone called it Station Hypo, using the phonetic code for the letter corresponding to Hawaii. Before Pearl Harbor, they could read perhaps 10 to 15% of Japanese naval messages, and most of those only partially. It provided some intelligence value, but nowhere near enough to predict major operations like the Pearl Harbor attack itself. The main Japanese operational code, which American cryptanalysts designated as System JN25, consisted of approximately 30,000 to 33,000 five-digit number groups in actual operational use, each representing a word, phrase, or concept. The system was ingenious in its layered complexity. Each five-digit group from the codebook represented a specific word or concept. To make decryption exponentially more difficult, the Japanese super-enciphered these code groups using additive tables. Essentially, they encrypted messages twice. First, messages were encoded using the codebook, converting plain language into five-digit groups. Then, random five-digit numbers from separate additive books were added to each code group using non-carrying addition. The result appeared to be completely random numbers, resistant to frequency analysis and pattern recognition techniques. Breaking this system required stripping off the additive layer through mathematical analysis, then determining the meaning of each five-digit code group through painstaking analysis of usage patterns across thousands of intercepted messages. Cryptanalysts had to identify which additive table had been used for each message, subtract those additives to reveal original code groups, then figure out what each code group meant. And the Japanese changed both codebooks and additive tables regularly, forcing cryptanalysts to restart the entire process repeatedly. The additive system used books containing 300 pages, each page listing 100 random five-digit numbers. To encrypt a message, the sender would start at a specified page and line, adding each successive additive to the corresponding code group using non-carrying addition. The receiver, knowing the starting point, could subtract the same additives to retrieve original code groups. For American cryptanalysts, identifying which additive book and which starting point had been used represented the first enormous challenge. Sometimes they could determine this through radio call signs or message indicators. Other times they had to test hundreds of possibilities through systematic trial and error. On December 1, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had changed to a new version of the system, designated JN25B by American analysts. The new version used a completely different codebook and new additive tables, forcing cryptanalysts to start over from absolute zero. Every code group they had painstakingly identified became useless overnight. Every additive recovery technique they had developed might no longer work. They were back at the beginning, staring at streams of five-digit numbers that might as well have been alien hieroglyphics. Rochefort had known an attack was coming somewhere. Traffic analysis, the study of communication patterns without reading actual message content, had shown increased Japanese naval activity in late November. Radio call signs were changing more frequently than normal. Message volume was spiking across multiple circuits. Ships were clearly moving into new positions. Something significant was happening across the Pacific. But the Japanese strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor had maintained perfect radio silence during their voyage from Japan. You cannot track ships that emit no radio signals whatsoever. The Pearl Harbor Task Force had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26th, taking a northern route across the Pacific, where they were unlikely to encounter merchant ships or patrol aircraft. For 11 days, they maintained absolute communications discipline. Not a single radio transmission that could reveal their location or intentions. It was the most profound intelligence failure in American history up to that point. Cryptanalysts, traffic analysts, and intelligence officers had pieces of the puzzle scattered before them, but not enough pieces to see the complete picture. Some warnings had reached Washington through other channels, Japanese diplomatic messages, encrypted in a different system. American cryptanalysts called Purple had been partially decoded and showed increasing tension between the nations. But these diplomatic messages didn't contain military operational details. They discussed negotiations and diplomatic positions, not fleet movements and target selections. The attack came as a complete and devastating surprise to forces in Hawaii. Rochefort understood that dwelling on past failures would guarantee future disasters. The only path forward was through the enemy's communications. If Station Hypo could break JN-25B, could read enough Japanese messages to understand their strategic plans, perhaps Pearl Harbor need not be repeated. Perhaps signals intelligence could provide Admiral Nimitz with the one weapon that might offset Japan's current superiority: foreknowledge of enemy intentions. Joseph John Rochefort had been an unlikely candidate for such critical work. Born in Dayton, Ohio, on May 12, 1900, he had enlisted in the Navy in 1918 at age 17. When joining, he claimed his birth year as 1898 to appear older and more eligible for advancement, a falsification that would persist in his service records throughout his entire career. He was commissioned as an ensign after graduating from the Navy's Steam Engineering School at Stevens Institute of Technology on June 14, 1919. His early career suggested nothing particularly special, just another young officer working his way through the ranks in the peacetime Navy. But a fellow officer noticed something others had missed. Rochefort possessed an unusual talent for solving complex crossword puzzles. He was excellent at auction bridge, an advanced card game requiring pattern recognition, memory, and logical deduction. These weren't trivial skills or mere parlor tricks. They indicated a mind that could find patterns in complexity, that could make logical inferences from incomplete information, that could hold multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously while testing each against available evidence. The officer recommended Rochefort for the Navy's cryptanalysis program, a small, specialized field that desperately needed talented recruits. In the early 1920s, naval cryptanalysis consisted of perhaps a dozen people working in cramped offices, barely funded, barely understood by line officers, trying to read the communications of potential adversaries. Rochefort proved to be a natural talent, but he possessed something beyond raw mathematical ability. In the mid-1920s, the Navy sent him to Japan for 3 years of intensive language and cultural study, from 1929 to 1932. During those years, Rochefort lived in Tokyo, studied Japanese at the Navy's language school, and immersed himself completely in Japanese culture. He didn't just learn the language mechanically. He learned how Japanese people thought, how they communicated, how their military culture shaped their decision-making processes. He understood Japanese concepts of honor, duty, and hierarchical communication patterns. This cultural knowledge, combined with his cryptanalytic training, made him uniquely qualified to lead Station Hypo when war finally came. He could read not just the words in intercepted messages, but understand the cultural context and implications behind those words. His deputy and chief cryptanalyst was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a Naval Academy graduate who had trained under Agnes Driscoll, the legendary cryptanalyst who had pioneered the use of IBM punch card machines for code breaking. Driscoll, known throughout the cryptanalytic community as Miss Aggie, had been breaking codes since the First World War. She had trained many of the Navy's best cryptanalysts and had made crucial breakthroughs against Japanese naval codes in the 1920s and 30s. Her insight that IBM tabulating machines could be adapted for cryptanalysis had revolutionized the entire field, bringing industrial data processing techniques to intelligence work. Dyer had been stationed at Pearl Harbor since 1936, longer than anyone else in the unit. He possessed an encyclopedic memory for code groups and an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns in seemingly random numbers. He could look at a partially decoded message and intuit what the missing code groups might represent based on context and usage patterns from other messages. During the intense period leading up to Midway, Dyer often worked extended shifts lasting days with the help of benzodrine tablets to maintain alertness. The amphetamines were standard issue for personnel working critical assignments that required staying awake for extended periods beyond normal human endurance. Dyer later explained his willingness to push himself to physical limits in oral history interviews. He figured there were people out there getting shot at in actual combat. If it should happen that working extended shifts inflicted some injury on his health in the long run, so what? That was a small price compared to what combat troops were paying daily. His colleagues joked that his desk sign was accurate when it read, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." The sign, visible to anyone entering the cryptanalysis section, captured the reality of the work environment. The cryptanalysis section was indeed a strange place by military standards. Officers worked in bathrobes and slippers when the heat became unbearable in the basement facility. The IBM machines generated tremendous heat, and the basement's inadequate ventilation made proper uniforms impractical during marathon work sessions that could last for days. Formal military discipline evaporated in favor of producing results. Rank mattered less than analytical skill in this unique environment. Rochefort fostered a culture where junior officers could question senior officers if the analysis demanded it, where credit for breakthroughs went to the team rather than individuals seeking personal glory. As Rochefort often said, "We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit." This philosophy was revolutionary in a military context where hierarchy and credit for success were usually paramount concerns. But Rochefort understood that breaking JN-25 required collaboration, cross-pollination of ideas, and the willingness to challenge assumptions, regardless of who had originally made them. A junior enlisted radio operator might notice a pattern that a senior officer had missed. A linguist might provide context that helped cryptanalysts understand the meaning of a partially decoded message. Everyone's insights mattered equally when it came to producing accurate intelligence. This collaborative culture would prove essential when the pressure reached its absolute peak in the spring of 1942. The linguistics section was led by Marine Captain Alva Laswell, who had studied Japanese for 3 years in Tokyo as part of the same exchange program that had trained Rochefort. During the Midway period, Laswell was actually promoted to major on April 29, 1942, though he continued to be referred to by his previous rank in many wartime accounts. He worked with 5 other linguists who represented the Navy's best Japanese language specialists available in the Pacific Theater. Their job was to translate the portions of messages that the cryptanalysts could decrypt, then work with intelligence analysts to determine what the messages meant in the larger context of Japanese naval operations. A partially decoded message mentioning carriers, aircraft, and fuel might indicate a training exercise, or it might signal an impending major operation. The linguists provided the cultural and linguistic context that helped distinguish between routine communications and critical intelligence requiring immediate attention. The traffic analysis section, led by Lieutenant Commanders Thomas Huckins and John Williams, focused on message externals rather than content. They tracked which stations were communicating with each other, monitored the volume of traffic between units, analyzed priority designations, and mapped the patterns of communication that might reveal operational plans, even when the messages themselves remained encrypted. Traffic analysis could provide warnings that something significant was happening even before cryptanalysts could read the actual message content. Changes in communication patterns, increases in message volume, or unusual radio procedures could all indicate impending operations. This small team, working in a windowless basement with inadequate equipment and an overwhelming workload, would soon face the most important intelligence challenge in American military history. The work was painfully slow and endlessly frustrating. Each intercepted message arrived as a string of 5-digit number groups captured by radio intercept stations scattered across the Pacific. Radio operators at stations in Hawaii, Australia, and other locations listened to Japanese naval frequencies 24 hours a day, transcribing every message they heard regardless of whether they could understand it. These transcribed messages were forwarded to Station Hypo for analysis. First, the cryptanalysts had to strip off the additive encryption using mathematical analysis. The Japanese used additive tables, where they added another 5-digit number to each code group using non-carrying addition. This meant that if a code group was 12,345 and the additive was 67,890, the encrypted result was 79,135, adding each digit separately without carrying to the next position. Decryption required identifying which additive table had been used for each message, then subtracting the additive to reveal the original code group. This process alone could consume hours for a single message. The cryptanalysts maintained massive files of recovered additives, organized by date and radio circuit, trying to identify patterns in how the Japanese used their additive tables. Once they had the original code groups exposed, the real analytical work began. They maintained massive card catalogues representing years of accumulated knowledge about what each 5-digit number might mean. They made educated guesses based on context, comparing how specific code groups appeared in different messages, building slowly towards certainty about meaning. A code group that appeared frequently in messages between carriers might mean aircraft or aviation gasoline or flight operations. One that appeared in logistics messages might mean fuel or supplies or ammunition. The IBM punch card machines helped them search through thousands of messages to find patterns, comparing usage contexts, identifying code groups that appeared together frequently, building networks of related meanings. But the actual analysis required human intelligence, intuition, and often brilliant intuitive leaps. The machines could sort and search mechanically, but only human analysts could interpret the results, make intuitive connections, and recognize meaningful patterns in the chaos of partially decoded messages. It was detective work of the highest order, requiring mathematical precision, linguistic knowledge, cultural understanding, and creative thinking all working together simultaneously. By March 1942, Station Hypo had made sufficient progress against JN-25 that they could provide useful intelligence about Japanese operations. The breakthrough hadn't come from a single dramatic moment of revelation, but from months of grinding work. Each recovered code group made subsequent messages slightly more readable. Each identified additive pattern made stripping the encryption slightly faster. Gradually, incrementally, the opacity of Japanese communications began to yield to sustained analytical pressure. They had contributed intelligence to the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, helping the US Navy locate Japanese carriers and achieve a tactical draw that halted Japan's advance toward Australia. Coral Sea was significant for multiple reasons. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never came within sight of each other, all combat conducted entirely by carrier aircraft. It demonstrated that American carriers and pilots could fight effectively against the experienced Japanese carrier forces that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. And it damaged 2 Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, keeping them out of action for the next major operation planned by the combined fleet. But the work remained frustratingly incomplete even after 6 months of intensive effort. Even at their absolute best, they could read perhaps 30 to 40% of any given message. Many messages remained completely opaque despite hours of analytical work. The Japanese continued to change codebooks and additives on regular schedules, requiring constant adaptation and rebuilding of analytical foundations, and the pressure was absolutely relentless. Every message might contain intelligence that could save American lives or prevent another disaster like Pearl Harbor. Every hour spent on a message that yielded nothing useful was an hour that could have been spent on something more productive. The cryptanalysts worked with the constant knowledge that their success or failure would be measured in American casualties. Every mistake, every missed clue, every incorrect interpretation could result in ships sunk and men killed. The weight of that responsibility never lifted, never eased, never allowed them to relax their concentration even for a moment. Then, in mid-May, they began intercepting messages about a massive operation unlike anything they had seen since Pearl Harbor. The traffic volume increased dramatically across multiple radio circuits. Messages flew between combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, submarine squadrons, battleship divisions, and invasion forces. Everything pointed to a major offensive scheduled for early June. Japanese operational security was generally good, but they had to communicate extensively to coordinate a complex operation involving dozens of ships operating across thousands of miles of ocean. Each message, even if only partially readable, provided another piece of the puzzle. The target was consistently designated AF in the Japanese location code system. Station Hypo believed AF meant Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii that housed a small but strategically important American airbase. Midway consisted of two small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by a coral reef enclosing a lagoon. The atoll measured just over 2 miles across at its widest point, but its location made it absolutely crucial to Pacific strategy. If Japan captured Midway, they would threaten Hawaii itself and possess a forward base from which to interdict American communications across the Central Pacific. More importantly, from the Japanese perspective, an operation against Midway would force the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto desperately wanted to destroy those carriers before American industrial production could replace them with new construction. He knew that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's once American shipyards began producing carriers in quantity. Japan needed to win the war decisively in 1942, while they still held numerical and operational superiority across the Pacific. But in Washington, the Navy's main cryptanalysis center, designated by the bureaucratic code OP-20G, disagreed fundamentally with Station Hypo's assessment. The organization, located in the Navy Department building in Washington, was ostensibly the superior organization in the intelligence hierarchy. They had more personnel, better equipment, and the significant advantage of being located at the seat of naval power, where they could directly influence high-level decision-making. But they lacked Station Hypo's specialized focus on the Pacific Theater and Rochefort's team's extensive experience with Japanese naval communications developed over years of concentrated work. The Washington analysts believed AF might be the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, an American territory that would represent a significant strategic loss if captured. Some thought it could be a renewed offensive in the South Pacific toward Port Moresby, Fiji, or Samoa, continuing the drive that had been halted at Coral Sea. Others feared an attack on Hawaii itself, or even some point along the American west coast, bringing the war directly to American territory. Without absolute certainty about the target, Admiral Nimitz couldn't position his forces effectively. If he concentrated his 3 carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else entirely, he would lose both his ships to a superior force and fail to defend the actual target of the Japanese offensive. The disagreement intensified through late May as the window for decision-making narrowed. OP-20G had been recently reorganized in a way that would prove unfortunate for American intelligence coordination. Lawrence Safford, a brilliant cryptanalyst known throughout the Navy as the father of naval cryptology, had been replaced as head of OP-20G by Commander John Redman, a communications officer with little actual cryptanalytic experience. Redman was competent in his previous field of communications and radio procedures, but was, as one later assessment noted, essentially untrained in cryptanalysis itself. He brought a communications officer's perspective to an analytical organization, emphasizing proper procedures and strict chain of command over analytical insights and rapid intelligence dissemination. The bureaucratic battle between Station Hypo and OP-20G was about more than just the location of the next Japanese attack. It was fundamentally about control of naval intelligence, about who had the authority to provide intelligence directly to operational commanders, about whether intelligence should flow through established bureaucratic channels or move directly to those who needed it most urgently. Rochefort reported directly to Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, his close friend from their years together studying Japanese in Tokyo from 1929 to 1932. This direct communication worked brilliantly within the Pacific Theater for operational purposes. Intelligence reached the commander who needed it without bureaucratic delays or multiple layers of review that could introduce errors or slow critical information. But it infuriated the Washington command structure and violated normal military procedures for intelligence dissemination. Rochefort was bypassing the established chain of command, providing intelligence directly to the fleet commander instead of routing everything through official channels and OP-20G for validation and coordination. From Washington's perspective, this violated proper procedure and fundamentally undermined central control of intelligence analysis. From Rochefort's perspective, war didn't wait for bureaucracy to complete its processes, and Admiral Nimitz needed accurate intelligence immediately, not after it had been reviewed, second-guessed, and delayed by multiple levels of command structure in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations who commanded the entire United States Navy, trusted his staff officers in Washington more than this informal arrangement in Hawaii that seemed to violate established military procedures. King was a brilliant but notoriously difficult man, known throughout the Navy for his abrasive personality and his absolute insistence on proper procedure and chain of command. He disliked Rochefort intensely, viewing him as insubordinate and dangerously overconfident in his analytical conclusions. Commander John Redman, who led OP-20G, deeply resented Rochefort's independence and insisted that all intelligence analysis should be centralized in Washington, where it could be properly controlled, coordinated, and disseminated through appropriate channels. The disagreement wasn't merely about bureaucratic territory and institutional power. Lives hung in the balance with every decision. If Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers near Midway based on Station Hypo's analysis and the Japanese attacked somewhere else entirely, he would lose both his ships to a superior force and fail to defend the actual target of the Japanese offensive. With only 3 carriers against Japan's powerful carrier fleet, America couldn't afford to be wrong even a single time. The Pacific Fleet couldn't sustain another Pearl Harbor-level disaster and remain viable as a fighting force. If those 3 carriers were sunk in a single engagement, nothing would stand between Japan and Hawaii except a few submarines and some land-based aircraft of questionable effectiveness. The west coast of the continental United States would be vulnerable to attack. The entire American position in the Pacific would collapse catastrophically. Everything depended absolutely on determining what AF meant with complete certainty. Actually, it was Captain Wilfred Holmes, one of Station Hypo's staff members, who conceived the brilliant idea that would settle the question definitively. Holmes was a submariner by training who had been assigned to intelligence work due to his analytical abilities. He possessed the practical mindset of an operational officer combined with a creative analytical mind that could think unconventionally. He suggested that Midway should send an uncoded message reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down and the base was running critically short of fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted this message and then reported in their encrypted communications that AF was experiencing water shortages, Station Hypo would have definitive proof that AF meant Midway Island. It was an elegant ruse, almost too simple to work effectively against professional intelligence services. But simplicity was its greatest strength. The Japanese were intercepting American communications just as actively as the Americans were reading Japanese messages. If they overheard an apparently unencrypted emergency message about equipment failures and water shortages at Midway, they would have absolutely no reason to suspect it was deliberately false information.
Water desalination equipment broke down regularly in tropical climates with salt air and high humidity. A shortage of fresh water would be a completely natural result of equipment failure at an isolated Pacific Island base. The Japanese intelligence services would naturally report this useful tactical information about a potential target to their operational commanders. Rochefort immediately recognized the brilliance of Holmes's deception plan and brought it to Edwin Layton, who presented it directly to Admiral Nimitz for approval. Nimitz was precisely the kind of commander willing to trust his intelligence officers and take calculated risks based on their assessments. He approved the plan immediately without hesitation. The garrison commander at Midway received detailed instructions via secure submarine cable, a communications method the Japanese couldn't possibly intercept, to transmit an emergency request for water supplies in plain language that anyone monitoring radio frequencies could easily intercept and understand. Around May 19th to 21st, 1942, Midway transmitted the planned message exactly as instructed. The transmission went out in completely clear, unencrypted language, reporting equipment problems with the desalination plant and requesting emergency water supplies from Pearl Harbor. Within approximately 2 days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report that confirmed their hypothesis beyond any possible doubt. The message, sent in JN25 code and partially decrypted by Rochefort's team using their painstakingly developed analytical techniques, stated clearly that AF was experiencing water shortages. The proof was absolutely irrefutable. AF definitely meant Midway Island. The Japanese were coming to Midway, but Washington remained stubbornly skeptical despite this compelling evidence. OP-20G insisted the attack would come sometime in mid-June rather than early June, while Station Hypo predicted late May or the first week of June based on date indicators in the intercepted messages. The date-time groups in Japanese messages were super-enciphered beyond the standard JN25 encryption, making them particularly difficult to decrypt accurately. OP-20G hadn't successfully broken the date-time encryption system despite months of effort. Station Hypo had achieved this breakthrough thanks to the analytical work of Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan working under Dyer's direct supervision. Finnegan discovered the specific method the Japanese used to encrypt their date-time groups. It was a completely separate system layered on top of the standard JN25 encryption, requiring additional mathematical analysis and pattern recognition. Edwin Layton, in his detailed memoir published decades later, specifically credited Finnegan with discovering the method that unlocked the Japanese date-time encryption. This crucial breakthrough allowed Station Hypo to determine not just where the Japanese would strike, but precisely when they would arrive. On May 26th, they intercepted operational orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting invasion transports and successfully decrypted the date-time data using Finnegan's analytical methods. The orders specified that the attack would occur on either June 4th or 5th, 1942, providing unprecedented precision for operational planning. This level of detailed foreknowledge was completely unprecedented in naval warfare history. Admiral Nimitz would know not just where to position his forces for maximum advantage, but exactly when the enemy would arrive in the target area. The Washington analysts continued to question whether Rochefort was being excessively aggressive in his interpretations, perhaps reading certainty into partial messages and letting his confidence overcome proper analytical caution. Admiral King remained fundamentally unconvinced by Station Hypo's conclusions, despite the mounting evidence. The career consequences for Rochefort, if he proved wrong, would be absolutely catastrophic. He would be blamed for misleading the Pacific Fleet commander, for risking America's last carriers on faulty analysis, for causing a disaster that would end American resistance in the Pacific. His naval career would be finished completely, and far worse, American sailors would die in large numbers because of his analytical mistakes. But Rochefort stood firmly by his analysis with absolute conviction. His team had been working continuous shifts approaching 24 hours for weeks, surviving primarily on coffee, cigarettes, and occasional sandwiches brought down to the basement workspace. The cumulative evidence was overwhelming to anyone who had worked through the analytical process. The massive volume of message traffic, the specific units involved, the extensive logistical preparations visible in the communications, the date indicators decrypted by Finnegan, and the water ruse confirmation all pointed unambiguously to the same conclusion. Midway Island, first week of June, 4 fleet carriers leading the attack force. This was definitely Japan's next major operation.
By May 27th, Rochefort's team had decrypted sufficient messages to provide Nimitz with almost the entire Japanese order of battle in remarkable detail. They knew the Japanese force would include 4 fleet carriers designated Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were precisely the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, representing the most experienced and successful carrier division in the entire world. They knew the force would include battleships, among them Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever constructed by any nation. They knew about heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers providing close escort and anti-submarine screening. They knew about approximately 250 carrier aircraft, flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of actual combat experience accumulated across China and the Pacific. They knew about the invasion force carrying 5,000 troops scheduled to land on Midway on June 7th, after the island had been softened by carrier airstrikes and neutralized as a threat to Japanese operations. The intelligence was so extraordinarily detailed that Nimitz's staff could predict the Japanese approach route with reasonable accuracy, estimate the timing of the first airstrikes against Midway, and even anticipate the probable composition of the attack formations based on standard Japanese carrier doctrine. On May 27, 1942, at a crucial Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, Rochefort and Leighton presented this comprehensive intelligence to Admiral Nimitz and his senior staff officers. The room was crowded with staff officers, many deeply skeptical that such detailed intelligence could possibly be accurate. Rochefort, still wearing his characteristic bathrobe, methodically walked them through the entire analysis, carefully explaining how each conclusion had been reached through systematic analytical work, showing them the partially decrypted messages as supporting evidence, demonstrating the step-by-step analytical process that had yielded such remarkably specific information. No navy in recorded history had ever possessed such complete and detailed intelligence about an enemy's operational plans before the actual battle commenced. It represented a cryptanalytic achievement of historic proportions that would never be repeated at quite this scale during the remainder of the war. The unique combination of Station Hypo's hard-won breakthroughs against JN-25, the unusually high volume of Japanese communications required to coordinate such a complex operation, and the Japanese assumption that their codes remained completely secure had created a perfect intelligence window into enemy planning. Nimitz now knew details about Japanese plans that many Japanese officers themselves didn't know yet. He understood Yamamoto's overall strategy better than some of Yamamoto's own subordinate commanders, who had been informed only of their specific roles in the operation. But intelligence alone, however accurate and detailed, doesn't win battles by itself. Nimitz still faced a terrible calculation involving overwhelming odds. He had exactly 3 operational carriers available. Enterprise and Hornet were in reasonably good condition and ready for combat operations. But Yorktown was severely damaged from the recent Battle of the Coral Sea. The carrier had been hit so badly that initial damage assessments by experienced naval engineers estimated 3 full months of repairs would be required at Puget Sound Navy Yard on the west coast. Structural damage to the flight deck needed extensive welding repairs. Damage to the fuel system required careful reconstruction. Fires during the battle had killed dozens of crew members and damaged interior spaces throughout the ship. Yorktown should realistically have been out of action until late summer at the earliest under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Nimitz made one of the most consequential and audacious decisions of the entire war. He told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had exactly 3 days to make Yorktown sufficiently battle-worthy to participate in the coming engagement. Not fully repaired to peacetime standards, not perfectly restored to original condition, but functional enough to launch and recover aircraft, to fight one more desperate battle before returning for proper repairs. The experienced repair crews initially thought it was completely impossible. They were being asked to accomplish in 72 hours what would normally require 90 days of careful work under ideal conditions. What followed was a near miracle of concentrated industrial effort and determination. Yorktown entered Dry Dock Number 1 at Pearl Harbor at 11 in the morning on May 28th. Over 1,400 skilled workers immediately swarmed the damaged ship, working continuously around the clock in rotating shifts. Welders repaired critical structural damage to the flight deck, working by arc light through the night. Electricians restored damaged electrical systems throughout the ship. Damage control teams patched holes in the hull and bulkheads. Some repairs were admittedly temporary expedients that would require proper reconstruction later, but they would hold together long enough for one more battle if the ship wasn't hit again in exactly the same damaged areas. The ship was actually still carrying some repair crew members working on final tasks when she steamed out of Pearl Harbor on the morning of May 30th, heading north at maximum speed to join Enterprise and Hornet at the designated rendezvous point. Approximately 48 to 72 hours of actual concentrated repair work, compressed impossibly into 3 calendar days through sheer determination and round-the-clock effort. It was a remarkable achievement that would enable Yorktown's absolutely crucial participation in the coming battle. Against Japan's 4 fleet carriers and their extensively experienced aviators, Nimitz could field 3 carriers with generally less combat experience among the pilots. The Japanese had been continuously at war since 1937 when they invaded China. Their naval aviators had accumulated hundreds of hours of actual combat experience in China and across the Pacific during 6 months of nearly unbroken victories. They had trained together intensively for years before the war, developing sophisticated coordinated tactics. Their aircraft carriers had operated together as an integrated strike force since the very beginning of hostilities, achieving nearly perfect coordination. American carrier doctrine was still actively evolving based on combat experience. Many American pilots had never experienced actual combat against a determined enemy. Some had only basic training in complex carrier operations and had never landed on a moving carrier deck at night or in bad weather. The disparity in operational experience between the two forces was absolutely enormous and heavily favored the Japanese. The comparative numbers were daunting in virtually every category of combat power. But Nimitz possessed the ultimate advantage that Rochefort had given him through months of analytical work: nearly perfect intelligence about enemy plans and intentions. He positioned his 3 carriers at a location they codenamed Point Luck, approximately 350 miles northeast of Midway, where they could launch a devastating ambush against the Japanese carriers immediately after the first strike wave against Midway's airfields had departed. The Japanese, supremely confident that they had achieved complete operational surprise, expected to attack the essentially undefended island, recover their aircraft, rearm them with anti-ship weapons, and then hunt for American carriers they firmly assumed were still at Pearl Harbor or at minimum several days away from the battle area. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, believed with absolute certainty that he would have many hours to conduct operations against Midway before encountering any American naval opposition whatsoever. He expected to bomb Midway into submission during the morning, then spend the afternoon methodically searching for American ships, if any happened to be in the general area. The distinct possibility that 3 American carriers were already positioned northeast of Midway, waiting in carefully prepared ambush, never seriously occurred to him or his staff. Japanese naval intelligence had confidently assured him that Yorktown had been sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea, that Enterprise and Hornet were thousands of miles away near the Solomon Islands, and that absolutely no American carriers could possibly be anywhere near Midway when his forces arrived on schedule. Nimitz's operational gamble was almost incomprehensible in its boldness given the stakes involved. If Rochefort was wrong about the location, timing, or Japanese force composition, the Pacific Fleet would be destroyed, and Hawaii would be essentially defenseless against follow-up operations. If Washington's alternative analysis was correct and the attack came elsewhere in the Pacific, Nimitz would lose both his carriers to superior forces and fail to defend the actual Japanese target. If the intelligence was fundamentally correct, but the subsequent battle went badly due to tactical errors or simple bad luck, America would lose its last 3 carriers, and the war in the Pacific would be effectively lost for years. Nimitz was staking absolutely everything on the detailed analysis of intercepted messages performed by a small group of exhausted men working in a basement with relatively primitive equipment. Everything depended completely on the accuracy of code group identifications painstakingly assembled over months, on the correct interpretation of partially decrypted messages where 30 to 40% of the content remained opaque, on the successful synthesis of fragmentary information into a coherent and accurate picture of enemy intentions. Rochefort and his dedicated team had provided Nimitz with intelligence of unprecedented quality and detail. Now American sailors and aviators would have to execute the battle that this intelligence had made theoretically possible. On June 3, 1942, Navy patrol planes spotted elements of the Japanese fleet approaching Midway from the northwest, exactly where Rochefort had predicted they would appear. The PBY Catalina flying boats, operating at the extreme limit of their range, found the invasion transport group first, then located the main carrier force. Each successive sighting report transmitted back to Midway and Pearl Harbor confirmed Station Hypo's analysis in every significant detail. Location precisely as predicted, timing exactly as calculated, force composition matching intelligence estimates. Nimitz's enormous gamble was being validated hour by hour. The carefully prepared trap was set and ready to spring. At dawn on June 4th, 108 Japanese aircraft launched from the 4 carriers and headed directly for Midway in the first strike wave. 36 Aichi dive bombers, 36 Nakajima torpedo bombers, armed with high-explosive bombs for land targets instead of torpedoes for ships, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters providing escort and air superiority. American radar installations on Midway detected the incoming formation 93 miles out at 5:45 in the morning. The defenders immediately scrambled every available aircraft to intercept the attack. The Japanese strike devastated Midway's facilities, destroying fuel storage tanks, damaging runways, hitting the powerhouse and command post with accurate bombing. American fighters tried desperately to intercept, but were overwhelmed by the superior Zeros. Marine Corps pilots flying obsolete Buffalo fighters suffered terrible casualties against the vastly superior Japanese aircraft. Ground-based anti-aircraft fire damaged some Japanese aircraft, but the attack achieved most of its primary objectives. The Japanese formation commander, carefully examining the results, radioed back to the carriers that a second strike would be necessary to completely suppress Midway's defenses. The runways were damaged, but still marginally operational. Some defending aircraft had survived the attack. The base wasn't completely suppressed as a threat to Japanese operations, but the first real shock to Japanese assumptions came when American aircraft from Midway attacked the Japanese carriers. Marine Corps dive bombers, Army Air Force heavy bombers, and Navy torpedo bombers all struck at the Japanese fleet without achieving any hits, suffering heavy casualties to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But they forced the Japanese to keep their combat air patrol fighters actively engaged. They disrupted Japanese deck operations and recovery plans. They demonstrated convincingly that American forces were far more capable and determined than Japanese intelligence assessments had suggested. Admiral Nagumo faced an absolutely critical tactical decision. His aircraft were returning from Midway critically low on fuel and needing to land immediately on the carriers. The after-action assessment suggested a second strike on Midway would definitely be necessary to completely suppress the base as a continuing threat. Following standard doctrine, he ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with land attack bombs for the planned second strike. Ordnance crews immediately began the laborious process of removing the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes from the aircraft spotted on the hangar decks, replacing them with high-explosive bombs specifically designed for use against land targets rather than ships. Then, at 7:28 in the morning, everything changed catastrophically. A Japanese scout plane that had launched late due to a mechanical catapult problem finally reported sighting 10 American surface ships to the northeast of the carrier force. The scout's initial report didn't specify exact ship types or include a carrier in the count, But the mere presence of any American surface ships in this area was completely unexpected based on intelligence assurances. Nagumo suddenly faced the very real possibility of American carriers operating in the area, something he had been repeatedly assured was absolutely impossible. Yorktown was supposedly sunk. Enterprise and Hornet were supposedly nowhere near Midway. But here were American ships exactly where they shouldn't be according to intelligence estimates. Nagumo immediately halted the rearming process and ordered his aircraft switched back to anti-ship weapons. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs capable of penetrating warship armor. The ordnance crews frantically reversed course, removing the land attack bombs they had just finished loading, bringing anti-ship weapons back up from the magazines where they had just been stored. The flight decks and hangars of all 4 Japanese carriers simultaneously became scenes of barely controlled chaos. Bombs that had just been mounted on aircraft were hastily removed and sent back below decks. Torpedoes were brought up from magazines and attached to aircraft. Fuel lines remained connected to planes as they were being rearmed, violating every safety procedure. Loose ordnance, both bombs and torpedoes, piled up on deck and in the hangars because there wasn't sufficient time to properly store everything below according to regulations. It was the single most dangerous situation possible on an aircraft carrier. Fully fueled planes surrounded by loose bombs and torpedoes scattered across the deck. Aviation gasoline fumes hung thick in the air throughout the hangar spaces. Fuel trucks and hoses everywhere, while simultaneously preparing for immediate launch against an unexpected American threat. At 10:22 in the morning, American dive bombers arrived overhead at the absolute worst possible moment for the Japanese. 3 squadrons of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had become separated from their fighter escorts and torpedo bombers during the long flight to the target area. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's entire air group, had extended his search pattern well beyond the originally expected intercept point, gambling his increasingly limited fuel reserves on successfully finding the Japanese carriers. His calculated decision paid off dramatically when he spotted the distinctive wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed to rejoin the carrier force after depth charging a reported American submarine contact. McCluskey followed that destroyer's wake directly to the Japanese carriers at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. The Japanese carriers were desperately attempting to launch their hastily rearmed strike against the American fleet that had appeared from nowhere. Their decks were crowded with fully armed and fully fueled aircraft ready for launch. Their combat air patrol fighters were all at sea level, having just finished destroying the last wave of slow American torpedo bomber attacks. The Devastator torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers had attacked with suicidal courage, knowing their slow, obsolete aircraft stood virtually no chance against Zeros. 41 torpedo bombers attacked in succession. 35 were shot down in flames. Not a single torpedo hit any target, but their sacrifice drew all the Japanese fighters down to sea level in pursuit, leaving the high-altitude approaches completely undefended at the critical moment. The dive bombers pushed over into their attacks from 14,000 feet, screaming down through clear morning air in near-vertical dives, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs with devastating accuracy against undefended targets. 3 carriers were hit almost simultaneously within a span of approximately 6 minutes that changed the entire war. Akagi took a bomb directly through the flight deck that detonated in the hangar bay among fully armed and fully fueled aircraft waiting for launch. Massive secondary explosions ripped through the ship as aviation fuel ignited. Fires spread essentially instantly through spilled fuel covering the hangar deck. Within mere minutes, Akagi was burning completely out of control. Admiral Nagumo and his entire staff had to abandon the flagship. Kaga suffered 4 bomb hits in rapid succession. The forward elevator was blown completely out of its shaft. The bridge structure was wrecked by near misses. Uncontrollable fires engulfed the ship from bow to stern. Ammunition and fuel explosions continued for hours as the fires reached magazines and fuel tanks. Kaga's captain ordered abandon ship but remained aboard himself, choosing to go down with his command. Soryu took 3 direct hits within seconds of each other, completely devastating the ship. The flight deck ruptured in multiple places. The hangar became an inferno as fuel fires spread uncontrollably. Soryu's crew fought desperately to save their ship, but the cumulative damage was simply catastrophic. After 20 minutes of increasingly futile firefighting efforts, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship. He remained aboard. Soryu sank 7 hours later, taking 711 men with her into the depths. All 3 carriers were effectively doomed within approximately 6 minutes of sustained attack, their crews abandoning ship as uncontrollable fuel fires consumed the vessels from within. Japanese damage control procedures, which emphasized firefighting over flooding control as the primary response, simply couldn't cope with the scale of the damage and the intensity of aviation fuel fires burning throughout the hangar spaces. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had become separated from the others earlier in the day due to maneuvering and escaped the initial devastating attack completely. She immediately launched strikes that badly damaged Yorktown, hitting the already damaged American carrier with bombs and torpedoes that brought her to a complete halt and forced evacuation of most of the crew. But American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu later that same afternoon and left her burning exactly like her 3 sister ships. By evening on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or abandoned, burning uncontrollably. Japan lost 3,057 men in the battle, including many of her most experienced pilots, mechanics, and maintenance crews. Among the dead were some of the most skilled aviators in the entire world. Men who had bombed Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, destroyed the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse, and dominated the Pacific for 6 victorious months. Their loss would prove completely impossible to replace within any reasonable time frame. The United States lost Yorktown, which finally succumbed to submarine torpedoes 2 days later while under tow back to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese submarine I-168 found the wounded carrier on June 6th and put 2 torpedoes into her hull below the waterline. A 3rd torpedo sank the destroyer Hammond alongside Yorktown. The carrier rolled over and sank on June 7th, taking many of her damage control crew with her. American casualties totaled 362 men killed. In approximately 6 minutes of near-perfectly executed dive bombing, the entire strategic situation in the Pacific War had fundamentally changed. The transformation was total and essentially irreversible. Japan had begun the war with overwhelming carrier strength that had guaranteed victory after victory for 6 months. After Midway, she had permanently lost 4 of her 6 large fleet carriers and could not possibly replace them quickly enough to matter strategically. Japanese shipyards simply could not match American industrial production capacity. The United States was about to commission dozens of new fleet carriers from its enormous industrial base. The new Essex-class carriers were already well along in construction, each one significantly larger and more capable than the carriers lost at Midway. Japan would never again conduct meaningful offensive operations. Every subsequent battle for the next 3 years would be fundamentally defensive, desperately attempting to hold what she had already captured against growing American pressure. The mathematics of American industrial power would grind Japan down slowly, but absolutely inevitably. The strategic transformation that Rochefort's intelligence had made possible would fundamentally shape the entire Pacific War until final Japanese surrender in 1945. And it had all begun with 5-digit number groups analysed on punch cards in a basement in Hawaii by exhausted men who refused to quit. The timing of the dive bomber attack, arriving precisely when the Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable moment with armed and fueled aircraft crowding the decks, was partly pure luck. But it was also partly the direct result of understanding Japanese operational procedures well enough to predict when they would be rearming aircraft, when their combat air patrol would be out of position, when they would be most vulnerable to attack from high altitude. None of that would have been remotely possible without the crucial breakthrough against JN-25, and the brutal analytical work that allowed Rochefort's team to read Japanese operational intentions with such unprecedented clarity. But recognition and credit for this historic achievement would prove frustratingly elusive and intensely political. The bitter bureaucratic warfare between Station Hypo and OP-20G in Washington actually intensified after Midway, rather than resolving. Both organizations publicly claimed primary credit for the intelligence victory. Washington argued strenuously that their analysis had contributed significantly to the success. Station Hypo insisted with equal vigor that their work had been absolutely decisive and that Washington's contribution had been minimal at best. The dispute became increasingly personal and bitter as months passed. Commander John Redman, who led OP-20G, deeply resented Rochefort's independence and his direct relationship with Nimitz that bypassed proper channels. Redman's brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, held a senior position in naval communications and actively supported his brother's efforts to centralize complete control of all cryptanalysis operations in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, strongly supported the Redman brothers in this bureaucratic dispute. King fundamentally believed in centralized command and deeply distrusted Rochefort's informal methods that violated proper procedure. In October 1942, just 4 months after the historic Midway victory, Rochefort was abruptly relieved of command at Station Hypo and reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. The official reason given was that he needed sea duty for proper career advancement as a line officer. Everyone involved understood it was actually punishment for perceived insubordination and failure to respect the chain of command. Rochefort had been absolutely right about Midway in every significant detail. His analysis had enabled the greatest American naval victory of the entire war. But he had bypassed the sacred chain of command, antagonized powerful senior officers in Washington, and made permanent enemies of the influential Redman brothers who controlled cryptanalytic policy. Admiral Nimitz was reportedly absolutely enraged by Rochefort's removal, but couldn't prevent it. King commanded the entire Navy as Chief of Naval Operations. Nimitz commanded only the Pacific Fleet as a theater commander. In any dispute between fleet commanders and the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations always won. Nimitz had recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal immediately after Midway, specifically citing his sustained superior performance and noting that his intelligence work contributed in large measure to the victory. King's office in Washington denied the award recommendation without explanation. Rochefort would never return to cryptanalysis work for the remainder of the war, despite his unique expertise. He commanded the floating dry dock, a backwater assignment completely inappropriate for an officer of his demonstrated capabilities. Later, he was assigned to various administrative duties at Pacific Fleet headquarters, pushing papers instead of breaking codes. He never received the sea command he wanted and had earned. He never advanced beyond the rank of captain, despite his historic contributions. When he finally retired from the Navy in 1953, it was without any of the recognition his extraordinary Midway achievement clearly deserved. The complete denial of appropriate recognition was a grave injustice that would take decades to even partially correct. But the intelligence work continued without pause. Throughout the rest of 1942 and into 1943, Station Hypo continued successfully reading substantial portions of Japanese naval communications, though under completely new leadership after Rochefort's removal. The continuing intelligence supported the brutal Guadalcanal campaign, where American and Japanese forces fought a desperate 6-month battle for control of a strategic island in the Solomon Islands. Intelligence derived from decrypted messages helped position American ships advantageously for crucial naval engagements, provided warning of Japanese reinforcement convoys attempting to resupply the island garrison, and gave strategic warning of Japanese intentions for counter-offensives. The intelligence supported the subsequent island-hopping strategy across the Central Pacific as American forces systematically bypassed strong Japanese garrisons and seized less heavily defended islands, progressively cutting Japanese supply lines and moving ever closer to Japan itself. Each operation benefited substantially from signals intelligence that revealed Japanese force dispositions, identified weak points in defensive positions, and warned of planned counterattacks. Station Hypo's continuing work eventually contributed directly to Operation Vengeance in April 1943, when American fighters intercepted and shot down Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft based on precisely decrypted flight plans. Yamamoto was flying from Rabaul to Bougainville to personally inspect frontline units and boost morale. Station Hypo intercepted and decrypted messages containing his complete detailed itinerary, including exact departure time, precise route, and scheduled arrival time. The intelligence went up the entire chain of command to President Roosevelt himself, who personally authorized the assassination mission. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters flew an extremely long-range mission from Guadalcanal, intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft exactly on schedule at the predicted location, and shot it down over the jungle. Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist, died in the jungle of Bougainville. His death was a psychologically devastating blow to Japanese military morale from which they never fully recovered. Thomas Dyer remained at Station Hypo throughout the entire war, eventually rising to the rank of captain. His crucial work on JN-25 and his direct supervision of the critical breakthroughs that enabled the Midway victory would make him known within classified cryptologic circles as one of the fathers of machine cryptanalysis. After the war ended, he became one of only 3 primary cryptanalytic trainers for both the Armed Forces Security Agency and later the National Security Agency, along with the legendary William Friedman and Lambros Kalimachos. His pioneering techniques for using IBM machines in cryptanalysis directly influenced an entire generation of signals intelligence professionals. Edwin Layton remained as Nimitz's intelligence officer throughout the Pacific War, continuing to provide crucial intelligence support for every major operation. He never stopped quietly advocating for his friend Rochefort, trying repeatedly to get him the recognition he had earned and been denied. Joseph Finnegan, who discovered the crucial method to decrypt Japanese date-time groups, continued his distinguished cryptanalytic career and became a leading figure in post-war signals intelligence operations. His breakthrough had been absolutely crucial to determining the precise attack date, allowing Nimitz to position forces with perfect timing. Without knowing the exact date, American carriers might have arrived too early and exhausted their fuel supplies, or arrived too late and completely missed the battle. The linguists, traffic analysts, and cryptanalysts who had worked those impossible marathon hours in the dungeon at Pearl Harbor went on to various careers after the war ended. Most never spoke publicly about their wartime intelligence work due to classification restrictions that lasted for decades after 1945. The institutional memory of their historic achievement remained completely classified until the mid-1970s, more than 30 years after the war ended. Families didn't know what their fathers and husbands had actually done during the war. Neighbors didn't understand why certain men had spent the entire war in Hawaii rather than fighting in combat. The cryptanalysts carried their secrets in complete silence for decades, unable to claim any credit for achievements that had genuinely changed world history. The true scope of American success against Japanese naval codes wasn't declassified until the mid-1970s, when the National Security Agency finally began releasing selected historical documents about World War II cryptanalysis. Only then could historians and the general public finally understand how thoroughly American cryptanalysts had penetrated Japanese communications, how much intelligence had shaped the outcome of major battles, and how absolutely critical the work of men like Rochefort and Dyer had been to ultimate victory. In the early 1980s, a determined campaign began to posthumously award Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal that had been denied in 1942. Admiral Donald Showers, who had worked in naval intelligence during the war and later served at the CIA, led the effort with remarkable persistence. He was joined by Navy Secretary John Lehman, who understood both the historical importance and the fundamental injustice of Rochefort's treatment. The campaign gradually gained momentum as more classified documents became available to historians and the full story of Station Hypo's achievements could finally be told publicly. On May 30th, 1986, almost exactly 44 years after the Battle of Midway, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal to Joseph Rochefort in a White House ceremony. Rochefort had died on July 20th, 1976, never knowing he would finally receive the recognition he had earned but been unjustly denied. His children accepted the medal on his behalf. The official citation praised his sustained superior performance and noted that his intelligence work contributed in large measure to the victory of United States forces at Midway. It was an understated description of the single most important intelligence achievement in American military history. The complete story of how one man's code-breaking expertise fundamentally changed the course of World War II reveals profound truths about intelligence work, leadership, and innovation under extreme pressure. Rochefort succeeded because he uniquely combined multiple rare skills: mathematical ability for pure cryptanalysis, linguistic and deep cultural knowledge of Japan gained during 3 intensive years of study in Tokyo, intelligence analysis expertise, leadership skills that fostered genuine collaborative innovation rather than hierarchical control, his willingness to bypass bureaucratic channels to get intelligence directly to the commander who desperately needed it showed genuine moral courage. His absolute insistence on analytical accuracy, despite intense pressure from Washington, demonstrated complete intellectual integrity. His creation of a work environment where junior officers could contribute fully regardless of rank showed truly enlightened leadership. He understood that breaking JN-25 required every single member of his team working at maximum capability, freely sharing insights, fearlessly challenging assumptions, and successfully synthesizing fragments into coherent, actionable intelligence. Thomas Dyer's willingness to work extended shifts lasting days with pharmaceutical assistance showed dedication that went far beyond any reasonable expectations. The entire Station Hypo team demonstrated that seemingly impossible challenges could be met through collaboration, innovation, and absolutely relentless effort. They understood that what they were doing mattered infinitely more than personal comfort, adequate sleep, or long-term health consequences. The men defending Midway, the pilots flying into combat against superior forces, the sailors manning battle stations depended completely on the accuracy of Station Hypo's intelligence. The technical achievement was truly extraordinary by any measure. Breaking JN-25 required not just mathematical skill, but intuition, pattern recognition, and the ability to think like the enemy. The IBM punch card machines helped with mechanical sorting and searching operations, but the actual crucial breakthroughs came from human intelligence applying creativity to seemingly intractable problems. The scale of the task was genuinely overwhelming. With approximately 30,000 active code groups, each message presented millions of potential interpretations. Finding the correct interpretation required years of painstakingly accumulated knowledge, brilliant intuitive guesses, rigorous validation through comparison with other messages, and the successful synthesis of partial information into actionable intelligence. There were no computers in the modern sense, no automated analysis tools, no machine learning algorithms. Just pencils, paper, punch cards, and human minds working at the absolute limits of their capabilities under crushing pressure. The cryptanalysts worked with the constant knowledge that every hour counted, that the next intercepted message might contain intelligence that could save thousands of American lives. The strategic impact extended far beyond the immediate Midway victory. Rochefort's work conclusively established that signals intelligence could provide decisive advantage in modern industrialized warfare. It demonstrated that investing heavily in cryptanalysis, even when the work seemed impossibly difficult, could yield results that literally changed the course of history. It showed military commanders that trusting intelligence analysts and acting decisively on their assessments, even when those assessments contradicted conventional wisdom or higher headquarters, could lead to victories that would otherwise be completely impossible. The transformation of the Pacific War that began at Midway created strategic ripple effects that would shape the entire world for decades. Japan's total defeat led directly to American occupation and the transformation of Japan into a democratic ally. The Pacific Island chains seized during the war would become key strategic positions throughout the Cold War. The carrier aviation tactics developed during the Pacific Campaign would dominate naval warfare for the next 8 decades. The cryptanalysis techniques pioneered at Station Hypo would evolve into the massive signals intelligence infrastructure of the National Security Agency. The lessons learned from breaking JN-25 profoundly influenced American approaches to signals intelligence throughout the Cold War and beyond. The integration of cryptanalysis, traffic analysis, and operational intelligence became absolute standard practice. The use of IBM machines and later electronic computers for cryptanalysis became fundamental to the field. The understanding that signals intelligence required not just technical skill, but cultural knowledge and operational expertise permanently shaped how intelligence agencies recruited and trained personnel. In 1985, a reunion was finally held for surviving members of Station Hypo and other Pacific War cryptanalysts. Men in their 60s and 70s gathered to remember their younger selves working impossible hours in that basement dungeon, racing against time to give their forces any possible advantage against a superior enemy. They shared stories that had been classified for 4 decades. The moment the dive bombers destroyed 3 carriers in 6 minutes. The water ruse that definitively proved AF meant Midway. The extended shifts fueled by coffee and Benzedrine. Rochefort working in his bathrobe because the heat made uniforms unbearable. Some wept openly remembering colleagues who hadn't survived the war. Others marveled at what they had accomplished with such primitive tools. All understood they had been part of something genuinely remarkable, that their work had mattered in ways that fundamentally